Hi everyone, welcome to our event today. My name is Brianna Toner and I'm the Manager of Client Services here at Azul Partners. We have a great program planned for you and I hope to cover everything outlined here on our agenda. But I want to invite you, the audience, to participate as much as you'd like and help direct the conversation with your questions. Simply enter in any inquiries you have into the Q&A widget within the audience console on your screen. That's just right on the left-hand side for you. Now, you may have noticed when you registered that the webinar today is part one of a two-part series. In part two of this series, we will discuss how to eliminate the checkboxes mindset. Check the boxes mindset. Both risk and organizations are growing and evolving. Continuous monitoring is a must. As such, we will cover how to build a business case and implement your universal risk language, a concept our speakers will touch on today's webinar. So speaking of, I'm thrilled to be introducing today's presenter, LexisNexis Group Product Manager, Juana Berlacote, and Spend Matters Chief Research Officer, Pierre Mitchell. If you're interested in learning more about our presenters today, take a look at the speaker bio widget on the right-hand side of your console. And while you are poking around, please take note of additional resources we have provided for you. LexisNexis has provided quite a few great resource links, and you also see today's slides available for download. Before we get started, in case you aren't familiar with Azul Partners or Spend Matters, I wanted to provide you a brief intro into our brand. The Spend Matters network of sites under the Azul Partners brand is the leading online B2B source for procurement and supply chain news. Spend Matters, one of our two parent sites, is the world's best and largest information source for procurement and supply chain professionals, enabling CPOs, consultants, and technology solution providers to make smart decisions regarding all things procurement. Our audience is a diverse, mostly executive group of procurement, finance, and supply chain professionals ranging from Fortune 500 to small startups, which might not surprise you. It's exactly who we have in the audience today. With that, I'm going to pass things along to Juana to provide a brief intro to LexisNexis, and then we'll get started. Juana, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Brianna. So I'm a group product manager for LexisNexis. We are a global company. We provide legal, regulatory, and business information, and we are also a technology company that helps our customers with analytics so that we can use the data to make sense and get insights into the risk. So we do a host of things, but risk management, supply vetting, those are our areas of expertise as well. We are a global company. We operate, we have customers in 175 countries, 10,000 employees worldwide, and our parent company is reliance. And I mentioned we are focusing on risk today and what we do for our customers here, but we also provide a lot of other products and solutions and insights and analytics. And there is a lot of resources that is available for our customers, our attendees today. And if you would like to access some of the ebooks, the white paper, and what customers have done, their use case in the market, how they have benefited. If you want to see the buyer's guide, you want to learn more about your certification process, all of that is available for you as a resource. In addition, our marketing team has also given us a go-ahead to promote our products and solutions at up to 40% off if you guys are interested at the end of this. Okay, that's about LexisNexis, and I will pass it to my co-presenter today, Pierre.
Thank you, Juana, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm really excited about today's webinar, not just because of the content and like to really geek out on this stuff, but also just because I have Juana here who spends a lot of time with her clients out in the trenches, so it's kind of great getting some of her and their collective insights here, so I'm really excited about that. So just want to kind of kick things off around looking at the different risks that are out there, and you've probably seen slides like this, but it's always just good to take stock of what, some of the current events that are happening. And I think probably the most front of mind that we see out there is certainly a lot of volatility with regards to the tariffs and some of the, I won't call it a trade war, but just some of the commercial conflicts that we have going on there, and namely the volatility around that, and trying to understand how does that impact our particular supply chain, and take these kind of macro events and then map them to our individual kind of spend categories and suppliers. You know, the issue, and then kind of if you look at the flood image, that's from Florence, just from a couple day or two ago. A lot of flooding going on that's affecting a lot of enterprises in agriculture, and so this is kind of the overflowing. You know, the dairy farms, the poultry farms, hog farms, things like that, having a big impact, not just on those industries, but obviously everybody that is downstream and touched by the river. So there's impact on factories, there's impact on the economy. So again, you want to be able to understand kind of how that maps those types of environmental risks, again, kind of tie to your supply chain, and depending on who you are, and will kind of determine how much you're impacted. Certainly on the logistics side, in terms of there's not just commodity volatility with oil prices, but logistics is a real issue in terms of risks in regulatory risks in terms of electronic logging. There's driver shortages. There's all sorts of things that are kind of creating a perfect storm in the logistics market. That's out there right now. Obviously, we have Brexit as a kind of a major issue for our European and UK customers. That is still a major issue as time ticks on and things are not resolved between those trading partners. Cyber is a major issue. I put the NotPetya virus example up there because that was one that was impacted a lot of major organizations. Maersk was a great example. Cost them something like $300 million based on how they got impacted. And it actually could have been a lot worse if they hadn't done some recovery. So it's a really interesting story, but just a great example of the cyber threats that are out there, especially if you have a large supply chain and lots of third-party contractors and suppliers who are accessing your systems and whatnot. It exposes that risk even more. And then, finally, just certain bilateral trading relationships, things going on with China, or just broader types of country-specific issues that are out there, are really important to monitor. So they're important to monitor not just in their own context, but again, how do you map that to your supply network, to your value chain, and be able to kind of say, all right, well, so what? How does that have an impact on your particular suppliers? So rather than us kind of just, talking to you about your specific issues, wanted to get your insights about what's the biggest risk that you're facing right now. So we have some choices here, and you might be able to see some risks across different areas. But if you had to pick one of these risks, what would it be right now? Is it is it political? Is it some of the economic issues? Are there some of the social issues, maybe sustainability or big GRC issues you have? Is it tech right now? Is it info security and other things? Is it legal, particular legal issues? So take your best guess. Pick which one is your biggest risk if you had to put it into one bucket, and go ahead and post that. And we will close this survey here in a few seconds, and we will evaluate the responses. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this and see where we are. Okay, all right. So this was interesting. Certainly, we have the social not really being an issue, environmental somewhat, but really front of mind is technological and political. And so, I'll comment quickly on the tech side, and then I'd like to invite Tawana in to comment here. Yeah, on the tech side, certainly there's a lot of, what's interesting is that, digital is affecting everything, right? As our suppliers and supply chains become more and more digital, the technological risk is just going to go beyond, all right, who's accessing our corporate, information systems in terms of applications, support, but tying into the actual physical supply chain with sensors and all sorts of things. So the tech piece is definitely creeping, outwards into a lot of these other risk issues themselves. So that makes a lot of sense as to it showing up as number one. But and then on the political side, well, I don't know, Pawan, I'll draw you in. What kind of strikes you on this distribution?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. While you're responding, as doing a quick math, right? There's 3 accounts for almost 80% of the risk, right, from today's responders today. And which is also not surprising because on the webinars we do and the customer interactions we have, these 3 consistently come up at the top, just at different orders sometimes depending on who your audience is. For political, not surprising because it's not just where we are today in the U.S., right? Just globally you are seeing this rise in this economic nationalism, right? Everybody wants to take care of themselves rather than, being more global trade openness. Like all of that we saw has kind of gone a different track, and now everybody's trying to say, I'm going to mind my own business, I'm just going to foster my own business, and what impact does it have in these multinational companies who are doing business all over the globe? How is one government's decision to kind of close the doors on the businesses, have impact on their supply chain and your vendors? So not surprising at all, and increasingly the rhetorics get a little bit more damaging, a little bit more negative. New policies are being put in place all the time. There's a raging war going on in the Middle East. It's just a lot of those things where, businesses and people doing risk management kind of feel like things are out of their hands. They cannot manage this giant, political event happening that is outside of their control, but they are tasked with managing the risk that's coming out of all of that. Environmental, again, not surprising. And there is a lot of 2 different ways here. One is companies consciously choosing to be environmentally friendly, taking care of the planet while doing good business. And there is another angle where it is being put in as a regulation, right? A lot of the ESG standards is driving towards certain compliance. You have to comply with certain environmental regulations. So either you're doing it because that's what you think as a good business you should do. You should be responsible and follow, you honor the environment that you live in, or you're doing it because there is a regulation telling you to comply. Either way, these are big economic risks. Again, similar to political, sometimes out of your control, right? Natural events happen, disasters happen. And I'm based out in Raleigh, and when we had the big Hurricane Florence, our office, for safety reasons, decided to shut down. Many of the businesses shut down for 2 or 3 days preparing for the event, right? And what does that have if you have a really small, tight-knit supply chain? What impact does it have on you, right? So it's just, again, not surprised at the answers, but again, we can start thinking about now how do you take these 3 main risk events that you care about, and how do you start putting frameworks to manage them? I think it's a good starting point. Yeah. Pierre, you want to take it?
Yeah, no, that's great. And that, boy, you brought up a lot of really good perspectives there. So, I think this, the idea around on the sustainability side, using framing that not just as a GRC issue, but really looking at it as something that by addressing it, proactively, we can actually apply maybe some interesting innovation in that area around sustainability. Maybe it's going to improve our brand. It's going to be better for talent management as the new workforce wants to do that. So these connections across these different risks, but also the way in which you address them, can be something where you can kind of have a good multi-headed solution and not just a multi-headed, problem. So with that, actually, it's a good transition to the next slide where, I just wanted to talk about a couple of the organizationally related issues in terms of dealing with risk management because, it's easy to focus a lot on the technology and the techniques and, and things like that. But, certainly there's a lot of kind of, business issues that continue to, to kind of plague this area. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of them and just give a couple of quick recommendations, and then we'll kind of circle back to some of these later. But so the first issue is kind of this issue of not investing in risk management and it continuing to be a problem because really there's no formal metrics on it. There's not a lot of incentives. There's not great accountability in terms of natural risk owners. So I think one of the biggest things that I've seen companies who've done this well is, they do provide some visibility into measuring risk itself, whether it's a kind of a risk score of some sort, whether it's numeric or just dashboards or just really having some visibility into it at the most senior levels is one of the key things here. Unfortunately, on point two, sometimes you don't really get that attention until something actually goes wrong, and you can kind of talk about it all you want, but until you've really been touched by some type of risk management event, it just kind of goes, unsung. So one of the things that you can do is, if you have kind of minor events, or if you see something that's happened to your competitors, or near misses, anything that you can use to kind of bring some visibility to it, it's always a great thing. It's always good too, if you can, to use some diagnostics, whether through your auditors or consultants or any kind of third party that has a good diagnostic framework for certain risk types that are of interest to you. It's a great way to kind of get a readout and see where your hot spots are, and then to be able to say, okay, who is the natural risk owner for this? And if there is, everybody's pointing at each other, that's a good opportunity to say we need to get someone on the same page. And if there is kind of a natural owner, then that's something where they can kind of take some action and say, okay, how can we put some better, diagnostics, predictive analytics around this, monitoring, all that type of thing. I think the other thing too is quite often risk management and compliance management also often get kind of confused and conflated, and I think it's important to realize that right now the C in GRC, the compliance side, tends to be focused very heavily on regulatory compliance and checking the box, if you will, versus really reducing true risk. So I think what I've seen some of the smart companies do is they use kind of the compliance requirements that they inherit from customers and from where they operate, and really use those in the right way, not to just be able to say, yeah, we're compliant, but to say, hey, since we are being measured on this, how do we then really kind of extend that out to our partners and through our processes around supplier management and other processes to really invest in capabilities that not just check the box, but actually mitigate against the risks. And hopefully, the spirit of why those regs came out in the first place was actually to help reduce some of those risks. So that's a great thing to do, is to really use real risk management and put some really harder numbers against that, versus just, this is just something we have to do because our customers have asked us. The next one is kind of this cross-functional integration. Is something that's really important, and you got to be careful not over-scoping things too much around kind of cross-functional integration, but at the same time, you can't be just looking at things in silos. So, for example, in supply chain, we see a lot of companies that'll have kind of supply chain risk management, councils or governance, or that the EVP of the supply chain will really focus on that area and tie in multiple risk types. But it's kind of focused around the physical value chain, and over time, kind of then aligning more and more with, let's say, IT risk and things like that. So, being able to find some natural alignment, let's say it's on InfoSec and IT, but kind of then aligning that with, let's say, as category management in terms of the IT category and procurement. There are some natural synergies that you should look for, as well as you might, if you're in procurement, you may look to take some of this market intelligence capability that you're building up and now kind of bring that as an enterprise capability around corporate intelligence, competitive intelligence, and such, just a way to kind of create broader value internally. And then the last two things I'll touch on is this information overload, and I think it's important that as there is so much information that's getting created out there, it is really important to really hone in on really what are the types of things that we want to monitor, and how do we just reduce the false positives, and how do we reduce just the things that are less important, and really focus on those key things that we really want to be listening for in the supply market, and make sure too that we are using really good tools and providers to kind of to get those really good insights, because otherwise you stop listening. If you stop listening, then you get the type 2 error, which is something that you don't want to have, where something sneaks up and surprises you. So, which kind of leads to the last point, which is, it is good to have some overall management framework that you can use to manage risk. And, sometimes you might have a start of this. You might have a corporate risk group, and they're using business continuity planning. You might have an internal audit group, and that's a very strong driver across, company. Some type of corporate function that can drive this. So it's good to kind of get these major players aligned and then say, great, how can we get synced up on this so that, let's say, on a corporate GRC standpoint, we can kind of extend this, capability out to our third parties, to our suppliers and our suppliers, and then, maybe get some intelligence back in on those providers and also kind of the regions and countries in which they're operating in to kind of get that outside in perspective. So anyway, just some observations and highlights. And Puana, maybe if you could just chime in a little bit on this and just some of the things that you're seeing with your clients out there.
Yeah, so we're increasingly seeing this need for customers to be less reactive, right? So your points up around, you have the metrics defined, you analyze the risk, and then you say, when this risk event happens, right, this is how I'm going to deal with it. But there is also a big shift going on around that is too late, right? It has already happened. I'm already going to face the cost for that risk event. So how do I become proactive, right? How do I start managing risk so that it does not happen? And how can I start alerting my stakeholders ahead of time? That way we have our plan B, plan C in place, and we can activate those plans. So the risk monitoring is important, right? But then how do you monitor? Is it reactive or proactive? Right? That is something that we see the trend shifting, and more customers are using and leveraging technology to get them there, because it's just not humanly possible. Just the information access we have is massive today. You can have access to almost all kind of information, as long as it's not violating any of your privacy, or if you have means, you have the financial resources, you can pretty much procure any kind of information you want. But there is no time to analyze those content. You cannot put 5 people in a room and say analyze all of it and come back and tell me what was the risk, what should I be preparing for, because it's just too late. Because the information goes in billions and billions of records. So we see customers trying to automate this finding, the analysis portion of your risk management being taken off the hands, and kind of using the AI and the machine learning capabilities we have in the market today to say, do an analytical work for me, because it can do it much faster with a lot more accuracy, less chance of human error. And they're really trying to leverage the risk management professionals themselves to act more as an informer and decision maker. So we do see the trend moving away to say, yes, we have too many areas of problem, but we have kind of found a process to streamline how do we manage, how we become proactive in the risk management space. Well,
I'm glad you brought up process management. We didn't actually script this, but it worked out well this way. I mean, one of the things I did want to just talk about quickly, not too much, is kind of just this alignment piece right around risk management and other areas in the business, because you'll find that there might be some areas where you, by making a better connection, you can actually kind of create a little bit of a win-win here and improve your influence and just get some better just benefit to the company. So that notion of business process management, which is a lot of times risk management gets looked at as kind of as a program or a project, versus really just an ongoing process that you need to have in place to make sure you are protecting all of the outcomes that you want out of all your other processes, right? So it's important to kind of make sure that you do have risk management really called out within these other processes, and that you're using it to kind of sit alongside other processes like sourcing, category management, supplier management, supply chain, management, et cetera, to do that. So the business process connection is key. Talent is another one. I had one client that when they were doing their category management, they said, we want to make sure that from a risk management standpoint, we really want we don't want really junior people managing a category that's really high spend and business impact and high complexity. We want to be able to make sure that we are training people with the best tools and techniques as they kind of get more experience, and then we can kind of give them more and more kind of strategic spend categories that have more value and and more risk. Another thing is performance management, and we could talk a lot about this, but I will kind of tie back to this issue on you're talking about RPA and efficiency. Efficiency is still there, right? You're only going to get so much budget. So, I was saying, efficiency funds effectiveness. So if you're only going to get so much money, if you can free up, people's time to kind of get out of lower value activities, that is going to then reinvest it into areas that are going to drive much more value. So like in supplier risk management, on average, we estimate that about 3 to 5 FTEs per $1 billion of spend are doing risk management, and it can be, distributed on who's doing it. But if you think about that effort, if we can free up, right, 1 FTE to get people to stop Googling and doing other, types of tribal and really just poor ways of doing market intelligence and analysis, that allows them to, use that time to really take that intelligence and then apply that to, driving some value. So, efficiency is certainly an important thing to, not forget, and certainly finance won't let you forget that. And then category management and SRM. We'll talk about category management in a second, but obviously, risk has to be infused into your category strategy. It also has to be a key part of supplier management. So when we look at supplier management around all of the service providers and solutions that support supplier management, that's a big area, right? Because it's information management, it's performance management, it's collaboration, it's innovation, but it's also risk management. And supplier risk management has to not just support, procurement, not just be a procurement lens, but also be an extension of that enterprise risk management process as well. And then finally, kind of this issue around engaging with your stakeholders and doing change management. Risk management is a great way to engage with stakeholders beyond beyond just spend and savings and things like that. A lot of times, your stakeholders are really concerned with certain metrics that they have around growth, right, or innovation or brand, or the things that they're really interested in, and they want to protect those things. And there's a lot of things that can do harm to those objectives that are out there in the supply chain. So the more in which you can kind of have both risk mitigation as well as kind of just a dollar, just a hard dollar savings kind of, way to engage them is important. So that's a key notion. And finally, kind of this issue, and tied into that, is that notion of kind of that change management and how do we use organizational judo, I call it, if there is something that's happening out in the business, some kind of competitive event. So, Amazon goes and buys 20,000, announces it's going to buy 20,000, small parcel trucks. That's going to be a bit of an alert for, USPS and UPS and FedEx to, take note as to, how do we best respond to that. And hopefully they've been anticipating that as well. So anyway, a lot of these adjacencies that are key to tie into, and it kind of really leads to the question of how resilient and agile are you? So if you're going to be focused on risk management, really the antidote to risk is agility and resiliency. So I always I like to use a superheroes kind of metaphor. So like if you get all this risk, you want to be able to be kind of like Plastic Man, right, or woman or whatever, and absorb the blow. But you also want to be able to be someone like, Spider-Man or Superman or Supergirl, whoever, someone that has X-ray vision or has Spidey sense, so you can kind of get some predictive insights, see something a little bit, see around the corner, see through the walls, if you will, and see into your value chain, right, and be able to get a little bit early, some early warning indicators, so that you can get ahead of it, before it really hurts you, get ahead of it before your competitors, all those things. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to get resilient and get agile, you have to be able to have, some overall frameworks, some processes for this, some metrics around it. So, just like you have cost of quality, there is a cost of risk. You can reduce your insurance costs by having better risk management processes and working with your Zurichs or whoever you're going to be working with on the insurance side, to show them that you're actually going to, be able to reduce the risk in your supply chain. And then some basics, right? You need to have some playbooks. You need to be able to get some governance and get some alignment cross-functionally. And you have to be able to look at this thing as more than just a project, du jour, and actually look at it as a systematic process. So, Pawan, I've been talking a lot here. I want to make sure I'm not kind of closing you out here, but just, I'm going to make a point here around kind of this just tied that issue around, again, kind of getting cross-functional alignment, but maybe if you just, offer some commentary around just some of the stakeholders that you work with within companies and how you see them working together or not, or just any trends there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So one of the, this is more recent, so it's fresh in my mind, right? So we have a couple of really large scale customers with business units and all over the globe. And to stay agile, to stay, to respond to the risk that's happening in the market, they've bought, from different business units, same solution, right, over and over. So we keep selling to the same customer, but then that one department doesn't talk to the other department because they feel like this is how we're going to manage risk, and we need to go and procure this type of tool and technology and content set for us to manage risk. And then somebody else on the other side of the pond is having the exact same idea, right? And they come to LexisNexis, they end up buying the exact same solution to solve the same type of risk. So this happens, right? It is, and again, it goes around saying most of the stakeholders, most of the personas that we serve are trying to manage risk. They're trying to stay on top of it. They're trying to adopt the greatest and the best, the method of solving the risk and staying on top of it. But, they're doing it in a way where maybe there is not a complete synergy, right? If you are trying to state a problem, to say I have a problem, which is I don't really know what information I need so that I can manage my risk better. The other person also had the exact same problem, right? And maybe there is one solution, but not having this common way of sharing the problems across departments, across groups, across business units, regions. It's building silos where there really doesn't need to be silos. But we do see that happening more and more, right? And then there is almost an aha moment to say, hey, we are all trying to speak the same language. We just haven't stated our problem in the same way. So we end up going around and finding the same solution anyway. So just a really interesting dynamics to see from outside in perspective how it's playing out.
Right, that's great. And yeah, I won't spend really any time on this slide. I think it's just one of the things I will recommend. Is if you're taking just a little assessment of how well you're dealing with risk, lay out your risk types. And if you don't have a framework, we'll talk about, PESTLE here in a second. But, look at your risk types that are really most important to you and kind of tune those a bit by your major stakeholders, and your category managers can kind of, do some of this. And then kind of plot that to, who are the natural risk owners for these. And sometimes it may be more clear, like with IT risk, InfoSec risk. Cyber, IT might be the natural owner. Other ones, it might be a little less clear. So it's good to, just like you'd have a RACI model to kind of diagnose your alignment in a process, do the same kind of thing around your risk types and see where you've got some gaps, in terms of overlaps or nobody's accountable. And then just say, great, how are we going to address this to just, kind of raise that up and start to bring some visibility to it. Because, if nobody's actually specifically gold on it, they're not going to get resources for it. If you don't get resources for it, you're not going to really be, managing it. And if you're not managing it, you're playing Russian roulette. So, okay. Well, I think we've talked a lot about kind of some of these inconsistencies or different, siloed perspectives of looking at risk and compliance, and that does extend to just the way the frameworks that companies, use. Sometimes companies may use kind of standard kind of probability of, adverse event versus impact, kind of standard risk frameworks. Sometimes they're much more tied into kind of compliance frameworks, ISO and other things. Other times it might be commodity risk, that finance is leading. So other times it's just very narrowly bounded around, hey, we're going to look at supply risk by looking at supplier financial risk, which is like, yeah, that's important. Certainly you want to make sure the supplier is staying in business and you want to look at their, their D&B scores or whatever. But, obviously supplier risk is broader than financial risk, and, supply chain and risk is going to be more than just, supplier risk, right? Actually looking at the network. So one of the best frameworks that you can use if you are a more progressive organization and you use something like category management, if you actually look at the old, circa 1983 Kraljic matrix around how do we segment and model spend, one dimension is, the impact of that spend and supply. not just spend dollars, but just total financial impact. And then the x-axis originally was labeled really, complexity of the market. But guess what? Complexity is really a proxy for risk, right? The more moving parts, the more volatility, the higher the probability for a risk event. And what's interesting is that the framework has basically evolved to kind of be more risk on the bottom and then kind of impact on the top. Now, the risk types that you use for any one particular category, so rather than just using this framework as how do we plot our spend categories as to little dots, that only goes so far. More and more companies are looking at, okay, in a certain spend category, how do we take our risk types within that spend category and see where we are and start to plot that out around that probability of an adverse event and really scenario planning that, and then what's the impact. And so however you organize them, you can kind of choose, but the more in which you can kind of adopt a common framework, just like you'd have a common framework on performance measurement categories, service delivery, cost, et cetera, any type of way in which you model something, using category management as a framework, and then within that, when you get to risks, rather than just like total cost modeling is a framework in its own right, cost types. Same thing goes to risk types. So the more in which you can kind of have a good risk framework, it's just going to help make your category management process more scalable. And the thing that's interesting about category management is that a lot of people implement it as category sourcing, right? We kind of look at the market, we define it, but at the end of the day, we go and do our drive-by sourcing event, throw it over the wall, and we're pretty much done. And then maybe have some contract monitoring and supplier scorecarding to manage the relationship. Well, the game is changing, right? So as we've, not to move into a post-sourcing world, but as we are now working with our large, complex, suppliers who are managing us probably better than we're managing them, we need a good way, just like on CRM and having kind of a single face to the customer, we need to kind of get our act together and say we need to have a single face out to the suppliers and to these large suppliers that we're interacting with. And so we need to kind of, just from an enterprise, GRC standpoint, how do we kind of know what information to ask for and bring back, as well as just from a supplier management standpoint, not just information management around qualification certification, but ongoing management of them. And if we're going to do that, this kind of information management isn't just going to be internal information between you and the supplier. It's going to really, the game changes towards intelligence, right? And so how do we go from data to information and then to kind of analytics, of which, AI is a lot of that, to really create that intelligence. And so now, if we're going to kind of create this broader view of all of these pieces of data that we're looking around our suppliers, it's not just going to be our internal systems, it's how do we get that outside-in view to know that, yeah, that supplier, successfully had qualified and certified on a certain, risk type. But hey, guess what? There's some things going on that we saw by monitoring some legal filings that looks like, they self-certified and they passed the auditor test a year ago, but something is going on that we really need to check out that warrants additional investigation and maybe an audit. So anyway, with that, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to send this over to Pwana, and feel free to reflect on kind of those last few slides, but maybe tie that into kind of how your solution kind of helps do some of these things we've been talking about.
Sure, thank you. So in your last slide, it looks like a really complex slide because it feels very complex, right? And if you're giving a customer with this, you have a category manager responsible for 15 different categories. Like one way of thinking about it is, you cannot humanly process all the data yourself and at the same time be aware of risk, do real-time monitoring, produce analytics, and on top of it, alert your stakeholders when things go south. So the one way of doing it is, moving away from doing a batch processing of risk, right? Don't wait for your vendor or your content provider to give you this, 1 month or 5 months worth of data, and then you have to analyze and go, and then make sense of it. Move towards more real-time framework. There's a lot of vendors in the market now are giving you real-time data, real-time analytics. And you as a category manager, you bring those skills into saying, in my category, for let's say I'm managing IT, and then maybe others are managing the HR software, right? So you can say these types of events happen to be more risk for my category, right? So you don't have to manage all 6 or 7, however many frameworks that you have put in place. for all the categories, right? Being knowledgeable about looking into the history of events and looking at what the data is telling you to say. For HR, I'm going to focus on these two risk frameworks, right? Maybe I'm going to focus just on legal, and I'm going to focus on political. I'm just making up examples for my transportation. I'm going to focus on environmental. I'm going to focus on maybe technological. If there is a port strike or something going on, I want to focus on that. So you can decide based on, because you do have the knowledge of the vendors, the goods and services that you as an organization procure, and how you categorize them and what type of risk happens to be high risk, because it doesn't mean other risk is not happening. Maybe it's just low risk. So once you start learning to score those risks, then you can say, I'm going to focus my energy on managing high risk for this category. And the high risk could be in legal for one, high risk could be political for other, technological for other, and so forth. So it just helps you manage and, get through your day without really being swamped down with this data, right? So it should be enabling you to make decisions, not taking you away from your thinking skills. So with that, right, how do you start putting things in buckets, right? That's what eventually the category manager is going to think about. And if you have really good information, right, that's where it goes down to. You can make really bad decisions based on bad data. So if you trust your data, if your data is clean, right, your vendors you can trust to provide you with the right side of data. You're getting the DNB report. It doesn't matter. Whatever source that you think that you trust and you need to use. Maybe you're using news, but it is curated news. It's not just everything that was confined. You can go and say, well, I'm going to focus on managing my reputational risk or my strategic risk, or is it the financial, is it the regulatory risk? And within that, you can start talking more and more about common languages when we talk about how can we be more efficient and more consistent in our risk management within an organization. You can start saying, hey, I'm going to focus on managing political risk. These are the events that I see happening. These seem to be high-risk events. Others are medium, and then some of them are low-risk. As an organization or as a department, what am I going to focus on? And do you agree? Having a stakeholder buy-in to make sure that you have, a method developed around when is it truly a risk event, when do you have to react, when do you need to alert somebody, and then doing that for each of your categories and say, for some of them are my strategic suppliers, I need to manage for all type of risk, and maybe I'm going to increase the threshold here. I'm going to manage not just high risk, but medium risk as well. And just having that honest conversation back and forth and tweaking it, right? So always stay agile. And it's a mindset, right? Mindset of agile, and we do, and I'm a product manager by profession. This agile way of thinking is testing out our concept, testing your philosophy, your method, and seeing if it works for you or not, being able to adapt, being able to change, iterate, with a better version of what it used to be before, and bringing it back to your stakeholders. Until you can do that, the agile way of thinking, you will not be resilient, because what you will do is develop a really, really good method, really good formula for managing, monitoring, being proactive, and then your market has moved, your competition has moved, your supplier has moved, there are new players in the market, and what you have is something that's outdated. It's not really agile anymore. So really adopting as a category manager, as a risk management professional, this agile way of thinking, taking risk, being okay with not being completely right the first time, but constantly improving upon what you have built and just keep delivering it, right? So that's one way of managing and staying current. I'm going to just move through that. And this is around moving, from traditional to operational, right? So one is around, of course, understand how do you want to manage, just, if you were to think about even in your daily lives, right? What are the main problem areas in your life? Because you cannot focus on everything all the time. And you can say, I'm going to focus on these three things, and I need certain data points to help me make sense of those three risk areas. And I'm going to be proactive into my decision making. Maybe I'm going to use technology. Maybe I'm going to use some of the automation where I'm not flooded with information all the time. I'm only alerted when something critical happens. And me, as a risk manager or my organization, gets to define what that critical event is. And then having a way to say, I want to be able to customize, because what you had a year ago will not work today, and being able to constantly adapt to your stakeholders' needs, to your market needs, to your regulatory needs, whatever is forcing you to change your risk management philosophy, constantly being able to change yourself, transform yourself. And that way, what you're doing is you're staying current. You're also talking to your stakeholders and your cross-functional units about using the same language to manage risk. So that way, when somebody yells fire, you know exactly what kind of fire they're yelling. And that goes a long way into evolving as an organization as well in managing your risk together. And you don't want to end up in a situation where, you know, everybody has gone in so many different paths, right, that you end up with, you know, one model in let's say 2017, come 2019, you're all over the place. There is no consistency anymore. Every category manager does things their own way. They have different tools, different data points, different thresholds. It's just really, really easy to get out of hand. But then if you have a common way of measuring, you measure risk the same way. That means there is a quantitative data that you can rely on to say, yep, this is a risk event. This is how I'm going to manage. And then you constantly evolve together. I'm going to go a little bit here into this kind of finding the needle in the haystack analogy, because there is just so much, right? And even within your supplier base, you cannot possibly manage risk from all of your supplier base. So maybe you go through some tiering exercises and you say, I'm going to manage, you know, my top 5 tiers. Within that, I'm going to apply a PESTLE-based framework. And that's around, you know, am I going to manage those 4 different, the wheel that I showed you guys earlier? I'm going to manage, you know, is it reputational, is it strategic, is it financial, is it regulatory? And within that, am I going to focus on political and environmental and social? And maybe my colleague, my other category manager, focuses on the legal, environmental, economic risk. And once you have that, being able to do a real-time analysis is really, really powerful, because it gives you a one bird's eye view of a trend that's happening around my supply chain. For some reason, my third party just happens to just float always in the legal risk. And maybe you will have another company who always sees the risk always floating around environmental. And then you start seeing the sudden spikes of maybe economic event happening, and you feel like maybe there is a crisis coming up, right? If you were monitoring this around 2008, you're going to see a lot of, you know, companies going out of business, a lot of financial instability. So it will kind of give you a bird's eye view on where most of your risk lives. And also a lot of these are subjective in nature. Your credit data, you can say, I can quantify it. But a lot of your data that's coming around risk is not so easily quantifiable. It's mostly qualitative data. So have an expert, right, either in-house or outside, have an analyst come and say, these types of topics happens to be most riskiest to a supply chain if you're in this industry. Once those topics, it could be in hundreds, you know, it could go up to 300, 400 different topics. Then your area focuses within your space, within your industry, within your category, because you are looking at things that will impact you. So not every event is going to be equal importance to you as an organization. So being able to see the bird's eye view, but at the same time being able to go and tell your stakeholder, I saw this event spiking for the last 3 days. I dived deep, and I see that all of these are high-risk events happening around headquarter and branch relocation. And if your stakeholder cares about how close in proximity the vendor is to your organization, they're going to want to know about this before they start getting delayed shipment or, you know, slower service and all that. So that's what makes you proactive.
Hey, Pawana, I'm just going to jump in. Sorry, I was just going to jump in here real quick and just answer a quick question. Was on the scorecards? I just love, I love getting into the scorecards and all that. Can these things be tuned a bit in terms of like either a functional view, or maybe some of these risk types are less important, or maybe I've got like D&B monitoring on the supplier financial risk, and I want to plug that in. How much flexibility do I have to kind of tune this thing to the category, to the user type, et cetera?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to here because this is the dashboard view, right? So there is a lot of flexibility. So when you say you monitor in PESTLE framework, it's one way of looking at risk, and you can look at news events, right? You can say what type of things are happening in the news, what can I score, that way I can only look for relevant news for me. But it's bigger than that, right? So you can say, well, what about the financial standings? Do I have the Experian report? Do I have the D&B report? and we have lots of proprietary data within our company as well. And we partner with a lot of providers around the world, and we can say who's being in the sanctions list, who is in the watch list, is my company in a blacklist, am I even supposed to do business in this country or with this person? Maybe they're a politically exposed person, and they hold, the majority holding of that company is with that person. And that person also happens to be in a contentious election, right? What's going to happen? Maybe the assets are going to be frozen. So do I really want to be doing business with them? So there's a lot of ways of making connections between data points, between companies, people within the companies, companies to companies that you can see. And this one is just giving you in a snapshot for one customer example, right? But if you look at some of our customers, they will have, big red flags saying that, 6 of your companies have been sanctioned, the vendors that you're doing business with. And sometimes you get a really smiley face, right? Everything is good, right? Nothing to be found, which is the perfect day. And then you have this things around, here's your credit report. Just go look at the credit report. What is it saying? And the reason we encourage a lot of these data points, like going from real time to kind of credit report, which is looking backwards a little bit, and to tell you, where your financial health has been and where you might be going, is that some of them happens real time, you need to know right away. Some of them happened 15 days ago and you're finding out today. And some of them just happened, right, within a couple of days. And marrying up all of those into one single profile, right, being able to say, for my vendor 1, they've been in sanctions, they have politically exposed person, the PEP person and the board of director, they have terrible financial record, and on top of it, for the last 7 days, I've been getting this huge spike in negative news. All of that tells a really risky story, right? Whereas some of your vendors might be living comfortably in a same medium risk level all the time, no major red flags going on, and that's just your state of risk. That's what it is, right? And very few in the low level of risk. Just having that visibility and being able to go deep dive and find out exactly what is prompting this particular organization to be high risk, and being able to alert, right? That's how you find the middle.
But there's nothing wrong with cherry picking a couple of the items that are in the red and using those when it comes time for negotiation, though, right? Get a little bit of potential leverage.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I'm here, and then this is, again, around building dialogues, right? Once you have data point, right, and you trust that vendor, you trust them to have good analytics, good rating, good scoring system in place, your QBR comes along, and you go to your supplier, and you say, hey, I saw all of these things happening. What do you have to say about it, right? Have an open dialogue with your supplier. Maybe they are also a business, right? They also have their risk management strategy. They might say, yep, those are all risk events for us, and we have already framework in place to manage our risk. That way you, as a customer, don't have to, face the risk, because there is data proving, a lot of the time that in 80% of the risk within an organization comes from outside of your organization, right? That's a lot of risk riding on third-party vendors. So that is the way of saying, are you doing anything to manage your risk? And if your vendor does not respond, has no risk management strategy, then maybe that's when you start thinking about how do you effectively manage or sunset this vendor out of your supply chain. Pierre, did you want to add anything here? All right. Hello, have I lost you?
Oh, sorry, I'm on mute. I'm talking away. Yeah. No, I was going to say, let's go to the next slide, because you have some good customer, examples that are, I think, are really great.
Yeah, and then I'm trying to be conscious of time as well. We have some time left. So this is a couple of our customer codes, right? So we're not using the names of the companies for privacy sake. But in a lot of the traditional risk management, you just start Googling what's going on with my vendor, right? I want to find out every information I have. And as much as I love Google myself personally, right, it's not always good, because you can get lost in this web of information, right, going from one side to the other. Sometimes, news not being validated, sometimes completely contradictory news being told by different sources, a lot of biases, a lot of things you have to put away, a lot of these are noise, right? You have to shift through to just get to your data. And it was consuming 90% of our, this organization, it's a global tax firm, their time. And they could not, and if we provide guidance to say you need to be proactive, you need to be monitoring it real time, we cannot invest those risk managers' time making them go through the thousands and thousands of Google articles, right? So that's one of the examples we heard. And around regulation, right? A lot of our companies, the utility companies, very heavily regulated, financial firms, banks, insurance companies, healthcare. A lot of these very heavily regulated industries had a really long onboarding experience. And most of it is because they're waiting for data to come up, right? They're waiting for the financial data to come up. They're waiting for regulatory data to come up. There's a lot of this data just waiting for either supplier to provide it to you or you're procuring it yourself, and then having an analyst shift through all of this data to tell you this is what the vendor's risk profile looks like, right? So we are really trying to cater to those industries where we already have access to data. And we try to come up and say, here, we've already built the profile for you. All you have to do is evaluate if that's okay for you or not. Sometimes companies choose to do this with some high-risk vendors, maybe because that's your only choice, or maybe there is a greater benefit, or maybe there's a competitive advantage, but you know your risk before you start doing business. And then there's one around, this 80% data. Again, a lot of the reputational damage to your organization happens because of something your supplier does. And most of the time, consumer doesn't have a way of seeing your supply chain, so the finger just points straight at you, and you become the person or the organization who did something bad. And this was around, the example I gave earlier about the PEP data. The politically exposed person was controlling majority of the vendor, and that person just happened to have a lot of negative things going around money laundering, bribery, corruption, everything that your company does not want to engage in, that person is engaged in, who also runs that company. So there is, a code summary senior risk manager, and it says you cannot put a price on avoiding individuals or companies that will put your reputation online. And then it's a little bit harder thing, and Priya, you touched earlier as well about how it's really hard to calculate an ROI. But one of our customers, and this is the same utility company, did go through this pain of calculating the ROI, and they estimated at the end of this program that it was equivalent, right? So the ROI was 1% of the annual supply chain spending, and it's a pretty fairly large company. That's a substantial ROI they saw. And so with that was it. Priya, did you have anything before we move on to one final poll question?
No, I think that's good. I think that ROI piece is definitely there is company, it's situational around kind of what can be counted, what cannot. But I think the other thing too is not to just use the ROI kind of death march, just hard savings, because sometimes you get like, look, this is just something that we have to do. You're going to get that top down, we must do this, as well as there's kind of the bottoms up, yeah, we can put some kind of, dollars against this, even though it might have to be a range. So I think, getting ranges in there and having both top down and bottom up can be really useful. So, all right, guys, we're getting near the end of the webcast. Just wanted to get a last kind of bit of data here around, what's kind of been your biggest barrier. So, we kind of talked a little bit here just now on ROI, but is it not everybody just even has the same understanding around risk? Is it there's no budget, there's no time to do it? Is it hard to build a business case? If you had to pick your one pain point, what would it be? I'd love to, would definitely love to get that from you. And I think we're going to run a little short here in terms of not having enough time for some Q&A. But one thing we definitely do is if you can submit your questions, we'll, Paul and I will kind of review those, get you some answers back, and then we can follow up on a phone call if you want. But definitely let us know what questions you have, and we'll definitely get back to you. Okay, so let's go ahead and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's kind of capture where the barriers are, and we'll kind of do some final reflections here. So. I'm not seeing there. There we go. There we go. So, well, that's really interesting, right? So it's not even just the ROI, right? It's just getting everybody on the same page with their own little view of risk, and maybe, not to say, hey, everybody's got their little piece, put it all together in PESTLE and you'll solve the problem, but definitely it does seem like kind of, just getting some alignment, across these different groups certainly is half the battle. But Puana, you want to just do any final comments or words before we send it back to Bree?
Yeah, I think that it's very telling, right, that not everyone having the same understanding. And it comes again and again, even if you start talking about, the simple like ESG, right? How do you manage ESG or how do you apply PESTLE? I think a lot of organizations have this awareness that something has to be done. But I think having all of the stakeholders within the organization speak the same language has been a constant challenge, right? And I think it's not surprising, and I think it stays as a challenge. And I think we as, so you guys as an industry expert, we guys as a solution provider, we need to do a better job of making the customers come to a shared understanding.
Agreed.
Thanks, guys. So with that, I just want to remind everyone that we do have a part 2 to this series. If you want to register for that, that is in the resource widget along with a lot of great toolkits. So there's a risk mitigation kit from LexisNexis. There's quite a few different resources there for you along with the slides from today's webinar. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me directly. I'm happy to pass it along to the presenters and we'll get your question answered promptly. I also want to extend a huge thank you today to LexisNexis for making today's event possible. We couldn't put on events like this without the gracious support of our sponsors, so really appreciate it. Thank you, LexisNexis. And thank you to our audience. Goodbye and have a lovely day.
Hey, everyone.
Thank you.